Well, listen, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you've joined us before, lovely to see you again. And if this is your first Campaign for Common Sense webinar, hello and welcome. Usual preamble from me. First of all, thanks for coming along. Please do bear with us if there are any IT issues during the course of the session. The format tonight is how we normally do things. So the first 25 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking Helen through a bunch of questions that I've got prepared that I'm really keen to work my way through. But when we get to the second half of tonight's session, we would really love to work through questions that you guys have submitted. So if you want to submit some questions, please use the question button at the bottom of your screen to submit it. And then my trusty sidekick, who's helping us behind the scenes tonight, will go through those questions and then they'll pass them on to me so that when we do get to that second part of the session, I can take Helen through them. A little bit about the Campaign for Common Sense. We launched last May in the middle of lockdown, which was the worst time in the world to launch a new campaign, but actually also turned out to be the best time in the world, given how things have gone since then. And we're just trying to be a really boring, sensible, hopefully grown-up voice in some of these debates. We believe that no one's got a monopoly on what's right and wrong. We think we've all got far more in common on these difficult issues than it might sometimes seem. We think that common sense and fair play is the best way to approach these issues. And we think that sensitive topics should be and can be discussed calmly and frankly without trading insults. And that's why we're running these webinars and sessions. And you know, that's why it's so flipping exciting to have Helen joining us tonight, because Helen personifies in so many ways that approach to challenging stuff. So a little bit about Helen now. She first came to wider attention for lots of us, I suppose, in 2017, when the grievance study affair hit the press. With her colleagues James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, she submitted fake academic papers to journals and got them published. Got them past peer review. They focused on queer, gender, cultural and race studies, and some of the more repeatable topics that they covered included rape culture amongst dogs, how men could overcome their transphobia by doing stuff to themselves I won't mention here because it's before the watershed, and my personal favourite was Mein Kampf rewritten using feminist terminology. But she didn't stop there. In 2020, she published with James Lindsay Cynical Theories, which I'm not remotely ashamed to plug here. I've got my copy. I'm working my way through it. I think it's great. It's a really, really interesting analysis of the intellectual and academic underpinnings of the kind of stuff that lots of us are worried about. And then more recently, she's set up Counterweight, which is sort of like a citizen's advice for the culture wars. And that's meant to be like a practical help for people trying to challenge some of these woke sort of ideas in the workplace, but to do it in the right way, do it in a way that keeps people talking and brings people together rather than getting into arguments and disagreements. So Helen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. To kick us off then, I'm going to ask you a question I ask everybody when they come to our webinars, which is, looking back at your school days, what was your favourite subject at school and what was your favourite part of school life?
I unequivocally hated school. English literature and English language were my strongest subjects, apart from French, which I was only good at because we spent a lot of time in France. So I can't really credit the school. So I was quite rebellious, refused to study or do any homework, then left at 16. Was kicked out at 16, and then worked as a care worker for 17 years before going back to university. So my school was a private school, and it was quite difficult to get into. And I didn't make the first cut, so I was one of the people who was called up when other people didn't take up the positions. Yeah. So I couldn't keep up with the subjects that I'm not naturally good at, the maths, science, STEM subjects, and I didn't like that school at all.
Okay, so basically, going back to your school days, and isn't something you look back on fondly, or that you think kind of, so was it formative for you though? Were your school days formative on you, even though you didn't enjoy them, or is it stuff that's happened since, which is really, yeah?
They certainly taught me how to bend but not entirely break the rules, and how to challenge authority using extremely polite language. It gave me a fighting spirit, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, and then you've already mentioned, so you went off and worked for 17 years, and then you went back to academic studies in your by your 30s, was that?
Yeah.
So, like, what was it that prompted you to want to go back after all these years, particularly if, as you said before, you hadn't particularly enjoyed sort of your academic studies at school? What was it that changed?
Well, I'd continued. I'd started studying again. On my own. I was working as a care assistant, but I was reading widely about a variety of things. I always had intellectual curiosity, even if I didn't like schooling. But when I was after I had my daughter, I had something similar to a stroke. And so I could no longer work, and I was sort of confined to lying down most of the time. So this was the opportunity for me to go to university and get my undergraduate and postgraduate qualifications in late medieval, early modern religious writing is what I studied.
And what was it that particularly turned you on to that subject? That's quite a specific thing. It's not necessarily something you would have covered lots of at school or elsewhere in life. So what was it that lured you into that?
I'm always interested in complex ideological frameworks. So for me, looking at women's religious writing before and after the Reformation is particularly interesting, because you get to see how women used religious narratives in order to obtain authority and autonomy for themselves in different ways under Catholicism than they did under Protestantism. And I could go on about this for a very long time. I won't. It's an interesting subject for me, because you can get right into the ideology and understand when people have been completely subsumed by this worldview and they're reading everything through it. So I was looking at it historically as an academic issue. I wasn't critical of Christianity in my academic studies. I was objectively neutral, but I was also part of the whole new atheist moment, and I was being very critical of religion, its irrationalism, its illiberalism, its lack of reliance on evidence. So that was a kind of natural segue for me. It's what I've always focused on: evidence-based epistemology and consistently liberal ethics. I think what you might call common sense.
So, and where did your liberalism, do you think, come from? Where did you pick that up? Was it something from your childhood and the way you were brought up? Was it something you sort of grew into when you were older? That's really interesting. You've got a very clear sense of the framework you want to work within. So where did that framework come from?
Primarily, I think what solidified the ideas that I had, which are based in individualism and universalism. The idea that we have a common human nature, but that we are individuals within that, and that is that the liberty of the individual should never be infringed. This, I think, is a matter of my personal temperament. But what has given voice to it in a framework, I owe a lot to Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors, which is the most sort of incisive dissection of different ways of looking at things. And his description of liberal science, as opposed to what they could call the egalitarian principle, where we just respect all ideas that are sincerely believed. No, we shouldn't do that. We should respect the right of people to have those beliefs, but whether or not they are true does actually matter. Whether or not they are ethical does actually matter. This is what we can work out between us as a species by discussing the various merits of ideas. And this is why, since we've had this marketplace of ideas, we have made the greatest advances in science and also in human rights that I think humanity has ever seen. So that's where my liberalism comes from. I have a strong opposition to anything that constrains the individual, which divides us from other humans. and which is unjust.
And as you've been doing your learning and your studying over the years, it's become quite clear that, you became concerned about the impact of postmodernism and critical theory on, academia, on liberalism, on the social justice movements and so on. Like, what was it that first got you really worried about that? How did that develop? How did that concern develop over time?
Well, I have to admit to being both worried but also fascinated by it. It's very much the same principle as when I studied Christian theology in depth, is that I don't believe it's a very good framework for understanding the world or forming moral ethics, but I'm fascinated by the way these ideologies work. So I think I'm in a position which is quite rare, in that I study in great depth and for many years ideologies that I don't think actually have much value for humanity. I was first introduced to this in my first year of undergraduate study, where our very first module was why liberal humanism is bad and why theory is good. And then we went into ways of reading, which was the different kinds of theories, which could all equally have been called how to utilize different forms of confirmation bias. Then we had to study postmodernism itself, and I was required to do a postmodern reading of a literary text, and for my own intellectual integrity, I felt the need to precede it with a disclaimer which essentially said everything I'm about to say is absolute nonsense. And then I did a postmodern reading of We Need to Talk About Kevin, drawing on Baudrillard and Lyotard, and yeah, I got this completely unironic comment saying, "You wobbled a bit at the first, but then it was wonderful." It worried me because it was so anti-scientific, because it was so culturally relative, and the idea of knowledge being a social construct that is created by powerful forces in society and is then perpetuated by the way we talk about things. So we have to dig deeply into language. Now, at this stage, with the original postmodernists, they weren't really about silencing people or about identity-based knowledge, but they did believe truth was a construct of language, of discourses. So as this has evolved into the various identity theories from around 1989, then we've got the standpoint epistemology aspect coming from feminism, where you have a certain knowledge because you have a certain race, gender, sex, sexuality, or whatever. And then we've solidified further since about 2010 into this really sort of concrete meta-narrative. Essentially, postmodernism started as a skepticism towards meta-narratives, and now it is a very simplistic one, in which the world literally is underlain by these invisible power systems called things like white supremacy, patriarchy, cisnormativity, and they're being perpetuated by the way we speak about things. We therefore have to control not only how people speak, but how people think. So it seems like there's a moral imperative to get into people's heads, dig out a bias which they are sure must be there, because these invisible systems absolutely exist and are the same for everybody, and unpick them that way. So this is a really strong belief system now, and we're making a big mistake when we're putting it in the same category as liberal efforts to address racial inequality, gender inequality, the persecution of gay people. So those big advances happened between the 60s and the 80s, where it was criminalized to discriminate by race or sex, and it became legal to have gay sex, and then we finally got same-sex marriage. These are all liberal advances in which we are saying everybody, we're all human beings, we all need to have the same access to the same thing. Every individual needs to be able to follow their individual path. That was the liberal thing, and now it's getting sidetracked by the identity politics thing, which I fear is sending us backwards and back into what is much more intuitive to humans, which is tribalism.
So clearly you've come across these ideas, you've tracked how they've developed in the last 30 years or so, and how they've, ironically enough, now become the kind of thing that they were originally opposed to or trying to counter. So like, you've engaged with loads and loads of people on these issues, including lots of people you don't agree with. So one of the things we're interested with about Campaign for Common Sense is how we can disagree well with people. So what do you think is the key to disagreeing well with people?
So I keep trying to do this, but every time I get invited to a panel to speak about intersectionality or decolonialism, everybody on the pro side suddenly decides they have something else they need to do. So I've not been able to have very many productive conversations with people who actually are full adherents to critical social justice ideas. Occasionally, I can, and with people who are sympathetic to it but not fully on board. And I think then where liberals like me can find some common ground with the critical social justice activists is to look at their critique of liberalism. They argue, for example, that it is the whole sort of idea of universalism and colorblindness, equality before the law, the civil rights movements. This is all apparently a dated white Western male thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if we can look at critiques of liberalism, which have been made by Marxists and by critical social justice activists and by conservatives, we can admit that there are some good critiques there. Liberalism has been a bit too complacent with its focus on the individual and the universal. That has allowed it to miss class analysis. It has allowed it to not look deeply enough at race, gender and sexuality issues. So I think if we can concede that to a critical social justice advocate and ask them if they can see any value at all in individualism and in empathy across groups and humanism, that's a way, I think, to find common ground.
Thank you. And then in terms of like people out there who you disagree with but you really admire, who are some of those people that you would think of?
I tend to admire people because I think that they have really good ideas. I have a soft spot for people who I think have terrible ideas, but that's not the same as admiring them. For example, Ibram X. Kendi, I think his ideas are downright dangerous. But if you read How to Be an Anti-Racist, you cannot help but notice his humanism and his openness. He believes what he is saying. He admits to having been racist against white people. He thinks it's possible to be racist against white people, that we mustn't think of racism as a thing inherent to white people, which is very different to Ibram X. Kendi, to Robin DiAngelo. And I really had hopes of him because I saw that he'd changed from a radical position to something more like a humanist position, but he has gone, he's quite authoritarian now. He will not tolerate any kind of disagreement or any alternative views or explanations for any disparities. You are either racist or you are anti-racist. You cannot be not racist. So James Lindsay and I wrote a response to that called How to Be Not Racist.
And actually that's a really handy way to wrap up that answer, because I want to move on now to some of the different bits of work you've done over the last few years. So let's talk about the stuff you did with James and with Peter when you did your spoofs, your grievance study stuff. So what was the most fun part of that? Because some of the bits in there is just so outrageous, so crazy, so much fun. So what was the most fun part of doing that, and what was it that spurred you on to do it in the first place? I'm imagining it was done over a few drinks, like lots of people have ideas over a few drinks or a night out, but then you actually went ahead and do it. So what was it that spurred you on?
So the fun, the satire, the humour, I'm afraid very little of that actually came from me. So I, when you are looking at a dog rape, humping incidences in dog parks, I'm afraid you need to look at Peter Boghossian. When you're looking at recommendations of inserting certain objects in certain places, I'm afraid you have to look at James Lindsay. But I was more of the theoretical writer. So if it was down to me, every single one of our paper would just have been identical to the papers that were already out there without any humour in them. If it had been down to Peter, everything would have just been hilarious satire, but not very theoretically accurate. So it was essentially James's job to bring these together, and he became really very well versed, particularly in men and masculinity studies during this time. So we got together to do this largely because we wanted to show people the scale of the problem. What was most frustrating to us at that time, we all three of us identified as left-wing liberals. Mm-hmm. We were trying to get left-wing liberals to see that there was a problem in the scholarship. They were telling us it's just a few mad students, or a few mad papers. There isn't really a big problem. You're blowing things out of proportion. So we drew together hundreds and hundreds of the worst papers with the worst ideas. Every single one of our citations is real. And we reproduced these concepts and these ideas so that they're not really best understood as hoaxes, because we were giving them precisely what they wanted, but we were trying to push to see what we could actually make them accept if they would take it to their logical conclusion. And in fact, when they responded to us, we thought, now this time surely we have gone too far. They're going to say this is unethical. We can't have students sitting on the floor in chains just because they're white. What's the matter with you? Yeah. Instead, we got a response from the reviewers saying, this is great and we'd like to see it implemented in classrooms, but are we still centering the white students too much? We couldn't make it we couldn't make anything so clearly nonsensical that they wouldn't accept it. And we were criticized because some of we had data and it was fake. Obviously, it was either impossible or really, really implausible. And both, whichever it was, we then drew conclusions from it that weren't warranted. So we had to have that in there. But only once, on one occasion, one reviewer declined our paper on the grounds that our statistical data and the way we'd analysed it was shoddy and worthless. That was, that one reviewer, I think, should feel very proud of himself. We obviously don't know who he or she is, but otherwise they just accepted it.
They just took the whole lot. They swallowed it all, other than that one person, almost proving your point.
Yeah, we were asked to make changes to certain things, but they were always changes which made it more ridiculous and less ethical rather than the other way around. For anybody who's interested, I'll you can see not only all of our papers, but all of the reviewer comments and how we were directed. We have a Google Drive freely available.
Wow. So if people want to delve into how the peer review process made it more that way rather than more sensible, that's available for people to see.
Yeah, I happen to know, and I can't tell you much more about them, but there is a group of feminist geographers who are actually doing that at the moment, because they are sensible, evidence-based feminist geographers, and they are really quite concerned about us being able to call dog rape incidents feminist geography and get them published in the leading feminist geography paper, where they publish their own empirical work looking at things like the distribution of medical supplies to South Asian women. So a lot of academics who are still very sensible, who are still working with empirical sociological data, they don't want this stuff mixed in with their stuff.
Yeah, so what you're saying is there's lots of people out there that don't want this nonsense going on in the journals and publications, and you guys have helpfully shone a light onto it.
Yes, I think so. I got one letter from a very angry person who said she was just about to publish her piece in Gender, Place and Culture, and then our dog humping paper revelation undermined the validity of the journal and damaged her career, and I should feel ashamed of myself. And I had to say to her, I think you should be thanking me, because why would you want to publish in a journal next to this kind of rubbish? Why wouldn't you want to root out this kind of nonsense, which says that if we look at enough dog genitals and ask dog owners about their sexuality, we can then learn how to train men?
Yeah, that's quite something, isn't it? And so, like, lots of people at that point going, do you know what, we've had a lot of fun. That's been really impactful, and would have maybe stopped there. But you haven't, have you? So, like, again, I'm just going to open the book again. So you and James did Cynical Theories. Like, this is a really heavyweight, really important book in terms of looking at the academic or intellectual underpinnings of these things. What was it that drove you guys to get back into the fray and write that book?
Well, we've been doing this for years beforehand. Sometimes people have said, you know, we're known for the grievance studies affair or the Sockle Squared or whatever they call it. But, you know, and they call it a hoax or a prank. But we were writing seriously about the nature of the problem and how it worked for years before that. The Cynical Theories is where we have brought all of this together, and it's essentially aimed at the layperson who wants to have an understanding of a few key principles and themes from postmodern thought, which have survived and evolved through various theories right now. So it's aimed, when I wrote the first drafts of it, I had in my mind somebody, an imaginary fictional young woman who is about to go to university and would be then asked to study queer theory, post-colonial theory, critical race theory. And I wanted her to have this as a guide, to arm herself with that first, and then to read the papers and to be able to see which of the scholarship is solid, which of it is empirical, and which is theoretical nonsense, which is really harmful and unethical.
And how do you think the book is performing in that regard then, since it's been published? Do you think it is helping people in that regard?
We're certainly getting a lot of letters from people who were our target audience. They're people with no background at all in the scholarship, but who are, you know, prepared to sit down and read it thoughtfully. It's not something you can digest easily standing up on a bus or something. You need to take your time with it, but it's all in there. You shouldn't have to look anything up. So we're hearing from a lot of people that it made the concepts make sense to them. They understood it. So yes, we have done that. Some people have said that we have oversimplified. Of course, this is the people within the fields, but we're not writing for philosophers or academics. We're writing for lay people. Some people have said it was still too inaccessible and that they struggled with it. We are currently producing a young adult version of it, which will be even more accessible. So we're hoping people, any adults who still found it so counterintuitive that it was difficult to get their heads around, could perhaps read the young adult version, and then I find it clicks. This is what I tend to do when I'm going into a new kind of theory that I don't understand. I read lots and lots of synopses of it, then the language clicks and I can get into it.
Wow, okay, so there's more to come in that regard then, in terms of the cynical theories line of stuff. And then obviously, like, other people might have stopped there, but you know, this year you've launched Counterweight, which is when we first spoke about things. Like, it's a huge amount of work to launch that kind of organisation that's going to give people practical help. So why did you do that? And then what kind of things have you had to help people deal with since launch?
Okay, so that started after the horrible death of George Floyd and the BLM protests. A lot of people's employers had started instituting new policies and training programs. allegedly anti-racist, equity, diversity and inclusion, and they weren't, that they were critical social justice based. A lot of employers, I think, didn't really know what they were buying into. They were box ticking, but we were getting a lot of panicked calls from people who are saying, I've got to pretend I believe that I am racist, or I've got to pretend that I have experienced racism in this very particular theoretical way. I've got to declare my gender identity, even though I don't think I have a gender identity and I don't believe gender is a real thing. So we've been getting those kinds of cases, and people facing disciplinary action, people worried about the directions in which their companies are going. Sometimes we've had employers who've said they need to provide some kind of diversity or anti-racist training, and they don't want to go down this critical social justice path, and can we help them? But really, it was like a tidal wave of people in immediate risk of disciplinary action. So I formed a Discord server, and because I found I was giving the same advice, same resources to people, and I just couldn't keep up with it. It was coming in faster than I could deal with. So I just kind of moved everyone to this Discord server so they could talk to each other. I could put resources up there. I could triage the most urgent cases. I got Kevin, our tech person, to set up and organise all of this. And then Carrie Clark, who used to work voluntarily for the Citizens Advice Bureau, came in and organised everybody for us. And it was the three of us for a long time that an organisation formed. We were actually, people were coming in, we were able to take the details of their problem, we were able to provide them with resources, help them write letters, practice with them for meetings, and deal with their cases one-on-one while producing sort of educational resources that were accessible.
And it's really taken off, hasn't it? In terms of, you know, you guys had a really good formal launch, didn't you? In terms of quite a bit of press coverage and lots of people wanting to understand what you do. And have you had more cases coming through since you formally launched? And are things better than you thought they might be, or are things worse than you feared? What's your take?
I'm optimistic. Yeah, when we launched, we had a huge flood, and it was I had to drop everything else at that point and take on cases where I'm not generally a caseworker unless it's an academic or theoretical issue. But it was all hands on deck. After we launched, we're getting into a groove now, training more caseworkers. We also have a listening service for people who are suffering from stress or other sort of really quite severe psychological problems for it. So yeah, that came in, and we've managed to kind of get that all sort of working as a system now. I seem to remember there was a second part to your question which I've forgotten.
Which is like I said, it was more around what kind of things have you guys dealt with, but I think we kind of cover that in terms of the stuff you're saying. So listen, so we're going to move on, if it's okay, to some of the questions from our audience. And I would just encourage everybody, if you're watching now and you've got a question you want us to try and put to Helen, please do so. Use that button at the bottom of the screen. I've got a few to get started though, so bear with me, Helen.
Please do prioritise any questions that are critical or disagree. I like to take those if possible.
So, here's a good one. Okay, so this is from, I hope I'm saying this name right, from Rushab. Did your years working in care give you a common sense perspective, or at least help bolster your thinking compared to full-time academics who haven't had to think outside postmodern frameworks? So did your years in care give you different perspectives to those that have been immersed in academia all that time, do you think?
I think it certainly prepared me for counterweight. I mean, I'm a care assistant married to a forklift driver, so I haven't been in an ivory tower all my life. I mean, I had a private education. I'm certainly economically privileged, so I'm not you know, I've had a blessed life, but I think that working with individuals in the way that I did, I did home care. So I go into somebody's home, they're elderly or they're disabled, they're having pain, they're having difficulty with things. I have to take in what their needs are, how to make their lives better, how to make them more comfortable, focus on the individual. And this was a very satisfying job for me, and I'm finding that that need is also met. I miss that work, but I'm finding that that need is also met by counterweight. When somebody comes in, they're a person, they're a human being, they have a specific problem. I can get involved in it, I can make things better. There's that same level of satisfaction there, and then at the same time I can do the academic research and writing. It's like, it's perfect. I have never been happier, and I have never been more useful, I don't think.
So it feels like you feel you found your personal sweet spot where you can bring together the, you know, the interpersonal, the pastoral, and the academic, and bring it together.
Yeah. I mean, I still hope that, you know, the intention of counterweight is to make ourselves redundant by fixing this problem. But we think, you know, there'll always be a need for liberal humanism. There'll always be somebody trying to be authoritarian, trying to shut other people down. So there'll probably always be a need for a liberal humanist organisation.
Well, and so moving on to the next question then. Here's a really good one from someone anonymous. Do you think that the academic journals have changed their ways since the Grievous Studies affair?
I haven't, unfortunately, I haven't noticed a significant improvement in their output. We're still looking at a lot of the papers that are coming out of them. They're still quite theoretically alarming. What we predicted journals would do is actually check out the writers, and we hoped that they wouldn't do that, because they should, you know, it's the ideas. If our ideas were good enough to be published, they should have been so, whether we actually believe them ourselves or not. So that seems to be what has changed, where if you try and publish an academic paper now, they're going to check you out and want more evidence that you are who you say you are now, and that's a lot down to us.
So they've almost focused on the ad hom rather than the ideas, which is ironic, really, given what they're about.
But I have seen academics within those fields distance themselves and say that their own work is empirical, that they don't do this kind of theoretical stuff, and I'm pleased to see that.
Okay, so I've got another question here. This is so from another person who hasn't put their name to it. So, what is your view of the tendency of groups to form communities, when often the original idea of aiming for equality was to bring a minority into the mainstream? You know, e.g., decriminalisation of homosexuality was about, you know, bringing gay people into the mainstream rather than forming a separate gay community or what have you. Why do you think that happens, and do you think it's a good idea or not?
I think that we're always going to be fighting against what Jonathan Haidt calls our groupishness, which is, I think, a neutral term for the tribalism and the territorialism, which is the dark side of humans. You know, if you read Nicholas Christakis's Blueprint, he provides strong evidence that we're going to do this. We're going to form in groups. We're going to form out groups. The best we can work for is trying to minimize this. As you said, you know, yes, bringing gay rights into the mainstream so that it's no longer surprising if you hear someone say, oh, John and his husband are coming for dinner. This is no longer a surprising statement. This is what we're aiming for.
Do you think so? You don't think we'll ever get rid of that tendency towards, you know, identifying with people that we've got lots in common with and hanging out with them? The best we can do is sort of try and keep it in its place, as it were.
Yeah, and I think we can sort of work this out in different ways. I don't think that we have to assume that the people we're going to have most in common with have the same amount of melanin in their skin or the same genitals. I think, you know, differences between the sexes obviously do exist, and there's, you know, male friendships and female friendships can be quite different. But I think if we're going to form groups, and we almost certainly are, it is probably best not to form them based on things like race or nationality or culture, and form them more on shared values, but whilst also respecting people's right to have other values.
Yeah, I think lots of us could relate to that. I've got a really good question here from Millie, who says critical social justice has become a dominant discourse, but many adherents still insist that they're a very oppressed minority. So how would you articulate to a steadfast activist that they're actually part of an orthodoxy, that they're part of the majority?
Yeah, this was half of a piece I wrote called "The Two Big Lies of Social Justice," and that is we have to accept now that this is a dominant orthodoxy. When people are applying for a job, they are asked to write an equity, diversity and inclusion statement. They're not asked to recite the Apostles' Creed. This is a dominant idea. It's in media, it's in politics, it's in education. So yeah, and yet the activists would still have us believe that they are an edgy grassroots movement dealing with issues that, you know, they seem to think we still live in the 1950s. How to deal with this, I don't know, but I tend to point out to them when they start defending corporations' rights to fire people for having the wrong ideas, that they can't really call themselves leftists when they are so corporatism, capitalism, and so anti-worker individualism and freedom.
It's really interesting, actually, that the way you describe that, because obviously my background is education. I've always worked in state schools. I did 15 years there. And it's a very similar situation in education, where those of us that are more of a, like, what might be called a traditionalist bent, that believe in the power of a knowledge-rich curriculum and children learning the best being thought centered, and rather than a child-centered education where the kids decide what they should learn and what have you, is often the people on the progressive side are the ones that are most pro ed tech. They're really proud of their Apple endorsed badges or their Microsoft training they've done. They tend to be most pro big corporations, and yet they will call us the traditionalists, who we're actually the romantics. You know, we're the ones that think it's about, you know, forming your own views and finding yourself through knowledge and learning and beauty and so on. We're the ones that often get called, you know, the neoliberals, or in bed with, you know, the dark right or what have you. So this argument that the people who actually are in power pretend they're not the ones in charge, and the ones that are fighting the war, it seems to be going all over the place, doesn't it? Like, has it always been like this? Or is this a modern development that the elites like to pretend they're not the elites, the ones in power like to pretend they're not in power?
No, I think this is new, because the whole idea that power is bad by default is very much a critical social justice thing. I mean, Judith Butler in, I can't remember which one it was, a contingency of something, argued that if we define the postmodernism too strongly, or post-structuralism, as she likes to put it, we could end up with this kind of orthodoxy. And I think we have. Foucault, I think, would be turning in his grave looking at it right now. And I think we just need to keep pointing it out. I think Generation Z needs to know that this is an authority, an orthodoxy that they need to fight against. It's their turn now to actually push back against this moral orthodoxy and to set up a better system, a more progressive system.
It's very Animal Farm, isn't it? It's like, you know, orthodoxy is bad, new orthodoxy is better. It's you know, Orwell could have predicted this, couldn't he? In terms
I've had this argument a lot of times when people were defending James Damore being fired, saying that they had the right to fire him for for posting a memo which went against the company's values. If I asked them whether they would approve of my mother, who was a second wave feminist and posted memos all over Lloyd's Bank demanding that women have access to accountancy qualifications, I'm fairly sure they would have said no, she shouldn't have been fired for that. The bank had the wrong values and she had the right to protest them. So this idea that we have the right to protest and we have the right to protest critical social justice is something that we really need to seed among a lot of the youngest people. And I think a lot of them are getting it.
Actually, it's really interesting you bring that up then. Do you think this has been able to take grip because of stuff we're doing in our schools or have been doing in our schools in recent times? And what do you think we should or could be doing differently in our schools to try to address that innate authoritarianism that younger generations that seem to be embracing?
Okay, so the first question there is really would require me to make a knowledge claim about whether the impact of education, and I don't know enough to do that. I'd advise people to look at the Don't Divide Us Education site who are looking into this more. I think that within schools we need to have a greater focus on viewpoint diversity, on getting a range of ideas out there. Just as a new atheist, I always said religion should be taught, but so too should a variety of religions and arguments against religion. I think critical race theory should be taught, but alongside it should be taught other forms of opposition to racism, which include liberalism, conservatism, religious beliefs, other approaches to opposing racism. And that's one of the books we're trying and failing at the moment to produce, is that the full range of Black intellectual thought on race and racism, right from Ibram X. Kendi to Thomas Sowell.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting because in our English, or should I say United Kingdom state schools, have for a long time legally been obliged to cover contested ideas in a balanced way and provide what they call credible alternative viewpoints. And what's been really interesting since I've immersed myself in this side of issues going on in schools, is one of the reasons why I set up the Campaign for Common Sense. I was worried about, what's the point of teaching kids to get smart and to think for themselves at school if they then go off to university in the workplace and they face all this stuff and it tells them what they should think. But actually what's become apparent to me in the last year is how much bad stuff is already going on in schools, where they're not just teaching them about, as you said, critical race theory or views on racism. They're telling kids this is how it is. This very contested idea is not contested, it is a fact. And that's actually illegal and has been illegal for a long time. But it seems that some people are either ignorant of that or they're choosing to ignore the law. So the question is, how do we change it?
I think this is something our project manager, Carrie Clark, is looking into in depth, and she's been talking to teachers like Calvin Robinson and Alka Sagul Cuthbert into what is actually happening in schools. Alka has just released a second edition of her book, What Are We Teaching Them? I think it's called. Or
what should schools teach? Yeah,
and so that's looking in that in depth. And I'm afraid I'm not an authority on schools, and I've tended to, when we get these referrals, pass them on to Carrie, who then passes them on to Alka or somebody who is. So I'm afraid you'll probably know more about that particular.
But again, I think that's something that's very interesting, and I'm sure our viewers, it will be really apparent to them back at home. What's interesting about how you go about stuff is if you don't know, if you don't have that domain-specific expertise or knowledge, you're very happy to share it and not speak on it, which is not something that lots of people would embrace or be so open about. So I think it's really helpful. Now, I'm just going to move on to one other question, if that's okay, from our audience. Critical theory rejects many foundations and concepts, such as truth and evidence-based logic. So if both sides are operating under such different paradigms, what is the way forward? How do we discuss these things if we're coming at it from a completely different angle?
I think if you have got a pure postmodernist who really believes that knowledge is totally unobtainable, and you've got a pure materialist who believes that it's absolutely obtainable. They're just got two different premises, and they're not going to agree ever. But I think most people are somewhere on the scale in between there, when you've got people who are leaning towards or are sympathetic to critical social justice ideas. They're not always going to completely deny the reality of objective truth. So it's not hopeless. I think over in the US they had that huge survey, Hidden Tribes, didn't they? And I took it, even though I shouldn't, because I'm not American, and it found that only 12% of Americans were progressive liberals, as they called it, which includes the critical social justice people, and it included me in that category. So I think there's a real small group of zealots. I think a good way to think about it is to relate it to religion. So at the top, you've got the theologians, you've got the people who are totally embedded in the system. They're thinking about it in complex and sophisticated ways all the time as their job. Then you have the priests who are teaching it to the lay people, who are, you know, sort of at a lesser level. And then you've got the lay people who are absorbing a certain amount of it, often in meme version, but are not completely familiar with or convinced by its central premises. So we're trying to address it on all those different levels. And I'm mostly focusing on the academic level, whereas a lot of the people that we're dealing with are focusing on a cultural level where it's being imposed on them by employers who don't understand it themselves that well. And we've had a lot of success in pushing it back in various organizations by just showing employers what it is.
So what you're saying is, like, your stuff is, if you like, dealing with the priesthood, the high priests and the theologians, as it were. But what's really nice about the counterweight stuff is that we're actually able to deal with people on those two other different levels, and actually sort of help them see the light in that regard. Yeah,
one of our members, and one of the good things with counterweight is when we've helped someone resolve a situation successfully, they often join us and become volunteers, and then they're helping other people. So we're really creating a groundswell. And one of our members, who is now one of our central team, managed to really push back, get herself on the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Board, patiently and diplomatically point out the underpinning ideas of what is underlying this training and unconscious bias. And she won. Essentially, she had it made voluntary, and it wasn't taken on by the company. And we're seeing this more and more often. Patient diplomatic persistence works.
So, given all the stuff that you've worked on, and given all the stuff that's going on with counterweight now, you've described to us about what you think we need to disagree better. How do you think we're going to, into the future, get more and more people to grapple with these ideas, disagree with them if you like, but disagree with them well? What's going to be the key to taking this on?
I'm still going with it with what we're calling the counterweight method, which is going to people and saying, look, we all know racism still exists. We all know that trans people face a lot of harder life than people who aren't trans. We can all care about this. Let's talk about different ways in which we can address this. Let's try and make it as inclusive as possible. Commit to not evaluating people's worth by their gender, race or sexuality, but not make anybody have to affirm one particular belief system. And that, I think, is the way that we can make those conversations work. It doesn't matter if I oppose racism because I am a liberal humanist, and somebody else opposes racism because he thinks we're all the perfect children of God. We can still agree that racism is a bad thing and it shouldn't be in our workplace, and oppose it.
And this is going to be my final question, and we'll be able to finish, hopefully, on a high. So you've got the counterweight method. You think it's working. You're seeing lots of evidence that it's going the way you want it. Do you think that we as a society can win this battle, can get back towards enlightenment in this regard? Or do you think, or are you a bit more skeptical?
I think we can. I think it's going to take time. I think I'm more worried at the moment about America, which has really come to a crisis point. I think it's still going to win. American liberalism is going to win out, but it's a harder job for them. For us in the UK, I think we are already pushing it back. It's too overt now. It's too extreme. It's too exclusionary, and this is being seen by more and more people. So while it still has a lot of cultural prestige at the moment, that we're still hearing cases every day of people being pressured into various ideologies, I think we are starting to push it back, and I think we can snowball that, and we can win this.
What a lovely, positive and upbeat note to end on. Helen, thank you so much for your time tonight. Thank you so much for engaging with the questions I put to you and the questions that came from the audience. Have you got any more? Are you working on any more books at the moment? Or are you just too busy with everything else? It sounds like you're very, very busy.
We're looking at counterweight. We're looking at the sheer diversity of Black intellectual thought. We're looking at heterodox forms of feminism. We're looking at how this is affecting psychology, and how it's affecting education. So there's a lot of books that are going to be coming out looking at this in different fields.
You're just a little bit busy then. Just got a few things on the go.
Just a bit.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, listen, again, thank you again for joining us. And to the audience, thank you so much for coming along this evening. And we'll let you know about our next webinar that will be coming up soon. But in the meantime, have a great evening. Helen, you have a great evening as well. Good luck with everything. And we look forward to speaking to everybody again soon. Take care and bye-bye.